Ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, welcome. I want to welcome also members of our Board of Trustees, members of our Scientific Committee, representatives of various embassies in Madrid, panelists, participants. Thank you very much for attending this event organized by the Elcano Royal Institute. In my capacity as chairman of the Elcano, I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to the seminar. To this seminar, Russia, the West, and the rest between influence and interference. As we all know, Russia has been a major historical power, not only, as we know, in Europe. A country that won the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, with enormous, huge suffering, huge costs, was the second great power during the Cold War, but suffered the fall of the USSR in 1991. The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, according, as we know, to President Putin. However, presently, Russia is the third great international actor, only after the US, and probably on a par with China and the European Union, and probably above both of them in geopolitical terms. In any case, we are dealing with a revisionist power seeking to regain great power status. It is true that despite its huge territory, natural resources, and nuclear power, Russia is probably an overvalued power. In the first place, overvalued by the Russians themselves, because of its internal vulnerabilities. An economy based on oil and gas, more or less the size of Italy, which is certainly not a great power, inequality and even high poverty rates and demographic decline, just to mention a few of these internal vulnerabilities. And as the world moves to renewable energies, Russia's leverage declines accordingly. However, as a country, huge country, which borders Europe, Central and Eastern Asia, and even the Arctic is, as we know, growing in importance, and has increasing influence in virtually every region of the world, cannot be left out of the international order. Thus, the West, the European Union especially, we need an open and honest dialogue with Russia and about Russia. We know we tried in the past, but we know too that we failed. Today's seminar, I hope, will be a small contribution to this purpose of mutual understanding. The first panel will discuss the fine line between influence and interference in the age of global information and the role in the West-Russia relationship. Russia has long argued that Western states are interfering in its domestic affairs by sponsoring NGOs critical of the Kremlin. Meanwhile, Russia's choice to weaponize internet technologies to influence other countries' domestic policies contributed to the worsening relations with the West, already almost broken by the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine. Russia and the West view each other as competitors, adversaries, rivals, and only occasionally as partners. So far, we have been unable to achieve a durable post-Cold War modus vivendi. So what are the prospects for improving dialogue between Russia and the West and reduce the risk of confrontation? Could help the principle of influence but not interference? A few years ago, I mentioned it almost before, indirectly, President Obama described Russia as a regional power. Could be, but in any case, in our region, in Europe. Moreover, since Vladimir Putin took over the presidency of the Russian Federation in the year 2000, but especially since 2012, Russia has carried out a sophisticated, well-resourced, and until now, very successful campaign to expand its global influence. Therefore, in the second panel, we will deal with Russia's role in the Middle East, in Latin America, especially important for us, and on its relationship with China. So the questions are now, what are Russia's main geopolitical and economic interests in Eurasia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in China? Do Russia's interests clash with the Western's own one in different regions? Can we identify relevant areas of cooperation and trust building? I'd like to conclude recalling the words of George Kennan. George Kennan, the American diplomat, written in 1961 in his book, Russia and the West, because what he wrote about the very old Soviet Union could help us today too. Kennan wrote, and I start the quote, The relationship we have with the Soviet Union has to be compared, if we are to determine its real value, not with some non-existent state of total harmony of interest, but with what we might call the normal level of recalcitrance, of sheer ordinariness and unreasonableness which we encounter in the behavior of states anywhere, and which I am sure we often manifest in our own. We will never have the total harmony of interest with Russia, but I am sure there are many, many interests that we share. I wish all the panelists and the audience an interesting and fruitful day. I'm sorry that the Secretary of State, Manuel Muñiz, cannot be with us this morning, so now I have to pass the floor to Charles Powell for the first panel. Thank you very much for being with us again. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Emilio. I'm not sure this is working. Is this working? Yes. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for being here in spite of the coronavirus scare. I have a bad cold, by the way, but please don't be alarmed. Or at least I think you don't need to be alarmed. Yes, Manuel Muñiz and his wife is expecting their first child, and she wasn't feeling well last night, so he asked us to apologize for his absence, and I'm sure you will all join me in sending them your best wishes. So we're very excited to be hosting this event. It's not our first event on Russia by any means, although we often feel guilty for not organizing more events on Russia and paying Russia more attention than we do. So let me start by thanking Mira Milosevic for having put this seminar together and for doing her best to cover the numerous issues that Russia's role in the international system gives rise to. In this first panel, as Emilio Lamas-Espinosa has said, we're basically going to talk about how we in the West can coexist with Russia. Before this panel was designed, when this panel was designed, we weren't aware of the fact that the Munich Security Conference was going to coin a new term, which I know you're all now familiar with, namely Westlessness. It's a wonderfully German concept and almost impossible to pronounce probably in any language except German, which I won't attempt. But the concept is an important one, and it's a useful one, because, of course, the title of this panel is Russia and the West, Between Influence and Interference, and, of course, the concept of what we mean by the West is in itself in question. Can we really still talk about the West or a Western world, given the state of the transatlantic relationship? Can we really argue that the European Union and the United States are on the same page as far as dealing with Russia is concerned? So this is perhaps one of the topics or one of the problems, one of the issues that our speakers will be looking at. The second issue, of course, is the whole question of influence and interference. I think one could argue, for example, that Bibi Netanyahu has largely won the Israeli election thanks to quite a lot of help that he's received from the Trump administration and this so-called peace deal of the century. So interference and influence are vague concepts which require definition. We all interact in an increasingly interconnected world, an increasingly globalized world, and therefore perhaps I would encourage our speakers to question or to look at these concepts as well. What do we actually mean by interference, and how can we distinguish between legitimate forms of influence and illegitimate forms of what we prefer to describe as interference? So ultimately, I suppose what we would like to find out as a result of this panel is whether our speakers believe, we have a US speaker, a British speaker, and a Russian one, whether our speakers believe that some kind of peaceful and, as Emilio Lamas-Espinosa was suggesting, constructive coexistence is actually still possible, in particular perhaps with regard to dealing with some of the big issues that we will be facing for the rest of the 21st century, like climate change, among many others. So I've referred to our speakers, and we have three excellent speakers, and I'm very grateful to them, again, for having braved the coronavirus hysteria and having joined us in spite of that. Our first speaker will be Sir Adam Thompson, who is director of the European Leadership Network, a very well-known former British diplomat, who now belongs to the so-called third sector, like us. So thank you very much, Adam, for being here with us today. We also have Jeffrey Mankov, who is Deputy Director of Russia and of the Russia and Eurasia program at the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Jeffrey, and well known to many of you probably through his work. And finally, we have Alexei Gromyko, Director of the Institute of Europe at the Russian Academy of Sciences and a member of the Russian International Affairs Council. Thank you for joining us, Alexei. He has a very illustrious surname. Perhaps he will want to explain exactly the nature of his relationship with someone else who bore that surname. There's an interesting story there, I think. So thank you all again for being with us today, and I'm sure this is going to be an exciting session. And Adam, without further ado, the floor is yours. If you can speak for about 10 minutes, and then perhaps I will encourage you to engage with each other before we throw the session open to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a great privilege to be here. I'm really grateful, I think especially to Mira for the invitation. I'm going to address my remarks chiefly to the question of influence and interference. And I want to make a general point and then an argument, and then, as we were urged to do, offer some practical, pragmatic suggestions. This is really the continuation of a conversation that Mira and I were having last October in Prague around a different table. So my first general point is to make the case for the importance of this subject about influence and interference. My own view of the West-Russia relationship, if it can still be described that way, is that the fundamental problems in it are not soluble in any meaningful time frame, because the urge on both sides to pursue spheres of influence is so deeply in the DNA that it is not going to be changed, and that therefore the chief task for diplomats and governments is risk management and, as you said, Charles, coexistence. If that's true, we're facing more or less indefinite competition, and I think quite dangerous competition in certain areas between Russia and the West. And I think that makes the whole question of influence versus interference highly relevant. Whether we're talking about color revolutions in Ukraine or interference in Catalonia, these are part of the friction that we see between the Russian Federation and quite a lot of its Western neighborhood. In fact, I think that the debate over influence and interference is really at the core of where the relationship now goes, because even influence is in the eye of the beholder and can be seen as a threat. We get very discomforted in parts of Europe. By the way, Charles, I'm in this capacity European rather than British.
Good to hear.
By things like fake news or even Russia Today. So I believe, in short, that consideration of a safer interplay on influence and interference is highly desirable, and it's therefore very reasonable for Elcano to pose the question, could we do better with a principle of influence, yes, but no to interference? So that's my first point. The second is an argument about how we should think about all of this. Of course, both influence and interference existed during the Cold War. In fact, very intensively in a communist democratic democracy ideological competition and interference by proxy by both sides around the world in the other's interests, if you like. But I want to argue that the context now is qualitatively different, and that implies real differences in how we should tackle the question. I don't want to labor the point. I could go deeper, but I think that while during the Cold War we were on some sort of recognizable peace to war continuum, with a contested center of the spectrum being the debate around influence or the other side interfering, whether it's Radio Free Europe or Echo Moskvy. I think we're now in a appreciably different state of the world, where the interaction between Russia and Western countries is far more permeable than it was during the Cold War. It intrudes much more on our home territory, whether that's internet or people visiting or, I don't know, acquisition of critical national infrastructure or whatever. It's somehow more compartmentalized, so the confrontation is less total. The West cooperates with Russia and vice versa in still significant areas of business, but confronts more sharply in others. And it's more asymmetric because, at least if you define the West as NATO, it's militarily far more powerful than Russia is. So we're more in a situation where we're not on a continuum, but we're actually at war during peacetime, where we don't just hold each other at risk, but where we are actually seeking to inflict damage, whether that is cyber attack or information warfare or interference, perceived or real, in election processes or other politics. So I think it's no longer quite helpful to see it as a continuum. We've moved into a third dimension, and we need to start thinking not so much about strategic stability as the management of strategic instability, not so much about a rules-based order, which trips off Western tongues so easily, which isn't always respected. And we can debate whether Soleimani's assassination was part of the rules-based order, but more norms-based, what it's acceptable to do or not acceptable to do. And therefore, that future West-Russia relations are less about treaties and quantities of weapons, or whatever it may be, but more qualitative, more about behaviors. If that's the case, then I think we can conclude that we need to make deliberation about what is acceptable influence and what is unacceptable interference rather more central to the West-Russia relationship than it is now. Because if in future the relationship is more dominated by trying to regulate behaviors, then we need to think much harder about how good we are at understanding the other side's intent. I think both sides are very poor at that. And we need to be much better at communicating to the other side what we regard as unacceptable interference and what we are prepared to tolerate as legitimate competition for influence. And that leads me finally to just a few thoughts about pragmatic steps forward. So if we're trying to make influence and interference rather more central in the Russia-West debate, how do we go about that? I think the first thing I want to say on this score is that you probably don't start there. I mean, my feeling is that if Russia-West relations are going to develop greater dialogue, we need to overcome some very traditional, old-fashioned stuff, which is the currency of diplomacy in the 20th century, in which both Washington and Moscow understand really well, and that's the strategic nuclear relationship. So if I was allowed to run this, I think I would start right now on a narrow path towards safer relations with better management of strategic instability via the P5 summit that we now seem likely to have, perhaps at the UN General Assembly this autumn, leading on to extension of New START, leading on, one might hope, to compromises over INF, leading on to real negotiations over modernization of the Vienna document on the conventional arms confrontation on the European continent, and confidence and security building measures in Northeast Europe. That would be my rather old-fashioned agenda for the short term. But I do think that for a slightly longer term, we need our political leaders to try to do some difficult things, but important ones. We need, in the West, to overcome this awful impulse, thoughtless impulse, that every time we think Russia has done something bad, we cut off communication, we terminate dialogue, we expel diplomats, we remove our own. That is exactly the wrong way of going about managing the 21st century relationship. Every time one side or the other does something that is regarded as unacceptable by the other side, the urge should be for more intense engagement, not necessarily to agree, but to convey difference and disagreement more clearly, to delineate where the red lines are more precisely. We therefore need to return to a greater emphasis on diplomats and diplomacy. I admit, self-serving, but I really believe in it. And I think we can look for a better dialogue in Vienna through the OSCE, which after all has 3 baskets, not just a security one. We need to work on rebuilding all-weather channels. We forget at NATO, which is where I last served as a diplomat, that the NATO-Russia Council was created specifically to handle crisis and then other issues if it can. And it is not managing to do that. We should be establishing better military-to-military dialogue as well. We can identify, I think, some obvious elements of structure in this discussion. So it might be possible for both Moscow and Western capitals to recognize that they will respect each other's laws, however unreasonable we think they are. And it might be possible to be clear that there is a distinction between overt and covert activity, and that these will be reacted to in different ways. Finally, we need a conversation about some of the practical limits of acceptable behavior in this area of collision between spheres of influence. The country I currently worry most about is Belarus, where I think NATO and the European Union have an almost unlimited capacity to get this wrong and to fail to understand Russia's red lines and definitions of interference. But I think it also applies, for example, in the Balkans and perhaps now in areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for those very thoughtful remarks and practical suggestions as well. And I think many of us in the room will share your defense of traditional diplomacy for reasons that I don't have to elaborate on. Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming this morning, and to Mira for her organizational talent, and to Elcano for hosting us. I also want to focus on this question of interference. In both the West and in Russia, this has become one of the central issues in the list of grievances that each has with the other. But I would argue that it is, in fact, not as central as we sometimes make it out to be. And that in part because it's not as central as we make it out to be, I'm both more optimistic and more pessimistic about our ability to deal with it. More optimistic because in the litany of problems between the West and Russia, I don't think interference rises to the top of the list. But pessimistic because of the fundamentally different ways in which the two sides understand what constitutes interference, and what behaviors on the part of the other they find unacceptable. And if it's impossible for the two to have a dialogue where they're understanding one another rather than talking past one another, I think the ability to make progress on this issue is going to be very difficult. In fact, interference is a problem precisely because the overall state of the relationship between Russia and the West, the transatlantic West, is as bad as it is. And that relationship is bad because of a whole litany of issues that I don't need to go into now. Many of them having to do with what happens here in Europe and incompatible visions for what the future order of Europe looks like. My fundamental takeaway would be that as long as those problems remain unresolved, and I think in many ways they are unresolvable, there's not much hope of fundamentally fixing the interference problem, because interference is in a way a symptom of the broader disease in West-Russia relations rather than the disease itself. Moreover, the West and Russia, and I'm going to talk particularly about the United States because I am from the United States. I'm not a representative of the US government, and I'm not speaking from the perspective of the United States government, I should make clear. But the US and Russia have fundamentally different views of what constitutes interference, and therefore while I think having a dialogue about the topic is important and appropriate, I think having some ability to really agree on how to manage or resolve the problem is going to prove very difficult. In Russia, when discussions about interference take place, they're usually referring to things that have to do not so much with particular actions on the part of the United States or other Western countries, but about the nature of the United States and other Western countries. I think certainly since the Bush administration, the war in Iraq, the pronouncement of the so-called Freedom Agenda, there's been a belief among much of the Russian political elite that the United States is a fundamentally revolutionary force, that it doesn't accept the legitimacy of especially non-democratic governments, whether in Russia or elsewhere, and that under Democratic or Republican administrations, the cornerstone of American foreign policy is the promotion of regime change. This concern, of course, could argue it began around the time of the war in Iraq, which was a military operation, but which also coincided with the outbreak of the first color revolution in Ukraine, in Georgia, and then in Ukraine. And around the same time that Russia proclaimed the ideology of what was then, called sovereign democracy, which effectively is that we are a sovereign country, we get to decide what is democratic and what isn't. You, the West, the United States, don't get to tell us what that means. Nonetheless, I think as history has moved on from 2003, 2004, very little has changed in this regard. And we've seen it again during the Arab Spring, during the protests in Russia when then Prime Minister Putin announced that he was coming back to the presidency in 2011, and then perhaps most prominently in Ukraine in 2014, where the outbreak of political upheaval was somehow connected with this idea of the West, and the United States in particular, as being fundamentally revolutionary, as promoting this idea of regime change, democratization, in whatever guise you would put it. Whether that is through the direct promotion of democracy through military force, whether it's support for rebel groups in Middle Eastern countries, whether it is the role of senior Obama administration officials in supporting the protesters on the Maidan. And so if the problem is really not specific behaviors, but it is what the United States is, then that's a very hard problem to negotiate about. This isn't a diplomatic problem. This is a much bigger problem. In the U.S., particularly since 2016, when we talk about Russian interference, we mean something rather different. And that, of course, is the kind of tools and techniques that were laid out in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report about the role of Russian actors in hacking, leaking, and otherwise seeking to interfere with the conduct of the 2016 election. And in response, of course, the United States Congress has imposed a round of sanctions and has repeatedly escalated the type and number and extent of sanctions imposed on Russia in response. Of course, this is also a type of activity that's not confined to the United States. We've seen similar activities in a number of other countries, including things that are both overt, such as Russian-backed media, as well as covert, the kinds of things like the hacking and leaking that were described in the Mueller report. Now, given these very different ways of framing what constitutes interference, I think coming to some kind of agreement about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable is going to be very hard. Part of the problem is that both sides reject the culpability. They reject the charges that the other throws at them. The United States would deny that it is a revolutionary power, certainly in the Trump era, but I think this would be true of the Obama administration as well, which deliberately downplayed the idea of democracy promotion as a core tenet of American foreign policy. Moreover, many of the things that on the Russian side seem objectionable, that look to be interference or that are classed as being interference are not things that are undertaken by the United States government. These are things that are undertaken by civil society, whether it's the Open Society Foundation, whether it is various NGOs that promote party building, that promote media freedom, that promote gender rights, that promote any range of causes. And we've seen in Russia's passage of legislation restricting the activity of so-called foreign agents, attempts to clamp down on these organizations. But because the problem, if you see it as a problem, is often not something that is tractable to political decision-making because it's not in the hands of policymakers, then it's a much bigger problem. On the other side, of course, Russia denies doing many of the things that the U.S. charges it with doing, including the interference in elections. And much of what, in fact, it is charged with doing are by nature not public or designed to be covert or designed to be carried out by various kinds of proxies. And so if there's not a recognition or an acknowledgement that any of these things are happening or that the government is in any way behind them, again, I think you have a challenge in figuring out how to negotiate about the problem. So, and also, one other thing I would add in this regard is that there's an asymmetry here, not only in terms of the kind of tactics, but also in terms of the importance that these tactics play in the overall strategic approach of the two countries. NATO and the United States have a significant advantage in conventional military terms. That means that if we think about the confrontation with Russia as a conflict, as a strategic competition, fighting the battle in the economic space, fighting it in the military space is inevitably going to favor the West. And so I don't think it's surprising that Russian strategy has increasingly looked to asymmetric tactics where some of the advantages in the conventional military and economic space would be blunted. And that's another reason why I think this idea of negotiation, getting, in this case, Russia to give up some of the things that the United States accuses it of doing is going to be hard because there's a strategic advantage that Russia sees in doing some of these things, one that helps counteract the fact that the Western countries are better positioned in many of the other fields of competition. So does that mean that I'm entirely pessimistic about this question of negotiations, about resolving this question of interference? Not necessarily, because again, I think interference is a tactic. I think it's a symptom of the broader confrontation. And the solution really lies then in two things. One is addressing some of the broader sources of that confrontation. And Adam already laid out many of the areas where I think a much more intensive dialogue between the West and Russia needs to take place on issues like arms control, nuclear as well as conventional, on regional conflicts in Syria, in Ukraine, on things that are happening in other parts of the world, far from the borders of either, on the nature of international norms and institutions. In all of these areas, bilateral and multilateral dialogue has been allowed to stagnate since the end of the Cold War. And now not only Russia, but China and many others are increasingly pushing back at what they see as an effectively unipolar order, one that doesn't give them the right to shape the rules of the game. And to be frank, when we talk about the problem of interference, it's not primarily, or it's not only a bilateral U.S.-Russia problem. It's a more broader problem of interconnectivity, interdependence, and one that even if the United States and Russia can make some progress on, doesn't do anything to address concerns about the role of China, of Iran, of Israel, Saudi Arabia, various other countries that in different ways seek to influence or interfere with political decision-making in other countries. So in some ways, I think the answer relies on broadening the dialogue, broadening the problem set, not addressing interference in isolation from everything else, but addressing it as part of a broader strategic dialogue. The other solution that I would put out there is really not something for diplomats, but something for domestic politics. And that is focusing on the sources of vulnerability that allow disinformation and various other kinds of nefarious or malign influence to actually affect political outcomes. Russia didn't cause Donald Trump to win the 2016 election in the United States. Donald Trump represents a particularly American set of pathologies. Russia may have contributed around the edges, but it didn't create Trump, it didn't create the circumstances under which he was elected. The vulnerabilities that the US has around income inequality, about racial inequality, about generational change, about migration, all of these things are indigenous to the United States. And if Russia is not going to exploit them, somebody else is, and that somebody may well be domestic. We have plenty of domestic actors in the United States who are perfectly willing to undertake these same tactics to push division, to sow doubt about the legitimacy of electoral outcomes and about the legitimacy of political institutions for their own ends. I just came from Germany, where I spent several days doing interviews and talking to people about questions related to Russian interference. And the contrast with the United States was pretty striking. Germany, of course, is a country that is on the front lines of this strategic confrontation between the West and Russia. It's a country where there is a substantial Russian economic, political, cultural, historical influence, and where various disruptive tactics have been employed. By and large, though, Germans are fairly sanguine about the effects and the dangers of Russian interference. And one of the things I was trying to get at was why. And one of my interlocutors put it very succinctly, and I think rightly. He said, we're less worried about this than the United States is because we're a healthier society. And I think there's something to that. Addressing the internal vulnerabilities that, whether it's Russia, whether it's populist or far-right movements domestically seek to exploit, is something that is, one, more tractable to political solutions. It's something that political leadership has more ability to affect. And it gets at a problem that is going to be exploited not only by Russia, not only by other foreign actors, but by domestic bad actors as well. And so when I think about what are the potential solutions, in addition to broadening the dialogue and engaging and having these conversations about what is and isn't acceptable, I think it's really important and in some ways critical for political leaders in the West, including in the United States, to address in a serious way the sources of these vulnerabilities that allow both foreign and domestic actors to use disruptive tactics as a means of promoting their own ends. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I very much liked this last point that you were making, that ultimately the resilience of the liberal international order begins at home. And it's those societies which have serious internal problems which basically open themselves up to this external influence. So we've had two different, but I think complementary takes on this problem, perhaps one stressing causes, the other one stressing or seeing this more as a symptom of those causes. And now we have our third speaker. Alexei, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Let me say how privileged I am to be invited by Elcano, and thank you, Mira, for initiating this meeting. Indeed, we met in Prague last year, and that was a very fruitful meeting. A lot of experts from many countries. And the meeting today is the consequence of something what happened recently. yesterday I came yesterday, quite early in the day. And yesterday my chaotic itinerary in Madrid placed me into Prado. And one of the consequences was my encounter with the portrait of Pyotr Ivanovich Potemkin by Juan de Miranda. And Potemkin was the ambassador of Russia in the second half of the 17th century in Madrid. So that was one of the many reminders of the long history of our diplomatic and political interaction. Now to the topic. I think that in most cases to discern between interference and influence on the world stage is not very easy, if not impossible. And usually these discussions are more scholastic than something that touches upon, tangible and persuasive things and analysis. If we interpret influence and interference in this or that way, or how we do it, depends on configuration and composition of power in the world, how we deal with each other, and how different centers of global and transregional power look at each other. The only thing which I would like to add to the discussion which has already taken place on notions of interference and influence is that I would like to add that the more a certain country feels itself vulnerable internally, the more it is keen on looking for external forces which ostensibly interfere in its domestic affairs. And this is something that Jeffrey has already referred to. So I would like to dwell more upon this piece of the puzzle, the composition of forces and why some countries find themselves friends and some countries proclaim somebody else their competitors and even rivals. Well, some important premises for the analysis of the world we are in. First of all, the political civil war in the United States, and as far as I know, the political history of the United States, what has been going on since 2016, can be compared only to something which happened from 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War. I mean, in what terms? In terms that the party which lost de jure recognized the results of the election, but de facto did not. And that was something what qualitatively was different in the consequences and the results of the presidential election in the US in 2016 in comparison with all its predecessors. The second premise is the demise, especially after the events in Iraq and Libya and Syria, the demise of aggressive so-called liberal interventionalism, a concept which was promoted probably not so much by the Americans but by the British. And Tony Blair was somebody who tried to invent the whole, concept with which he put forward during his speech in Chicago in 1999. So it seems to me that these days there are few supporters of the regime change concept or the military expert of norms and values, not to mention other factors. The demise of neoliberal political economy and neoliberal economic school of third, which was discredited by the Great Recession. And the demise of the unipolar world, underpinned by a notion of a benign empire. The unipolar moment and all articles and even books which were written back in the 90s and in the beginning of this century on how the world can be led by only one superpower and even a benign empire, but empire which is very different in its nature from all its predecessors. Well, now some comments on Europe, and to be more precise, on the European Union. I think that major features are new populism and the break-up of the traditional party political systems in many countries. Of course, Brexit. The Brexit, first of all, if not to take it as a case for country studies, but as something what influences the whole political process in Europe. The Brexit as a blow to the doctrine and narrative of the European ever closer union. That was the first time when a member state of the European Union decided, and not just decided, but left the EU. The problem of political leadership and fragmentation of political elites. This is what specialists on political science, on political process have been discussing so extensively in Europe and beyond. And the last but not the least, the fact of multi-speed Europe and its strategic autonomy. If the idea of multi-speed Europe is going to buttress the European Union and to help it to overcome all its present difficulties, and if the EU succeeds in pursuing this great goal of strategic autonomy, which was proclaimed in the global strategy of the European Union, published in June 2016. I think that these are big issues for the foreseeable, for how the European Union is going to develop in the foreseeable future. A few words on Russia. Well, this is the 6th biggest world economy in purchasing power parity terms, but just below 3% of global GDP in nominal terms. A major military space and energy power, but still it cannot be compared to the influence enjoyed by the Soviet Union. The population exceeds 146 million, but at best stagnating, and prospects are not good, although not catastrophic. The public debt is about 17% of Russia's GDP, which is something what any member state of the European Union would like to have. I would like to remember you that 60% is something what the member states of the European Union should not exceed. And instead of the deficit of its state budget, Russia has its proficit. Inflation is about 3%, which for Russia is an excellent figure. Leading vulnerabilities are the lopsided nature of the Russian economy, unacceptable levels of social inequalities, the rigidity of the party political system, and of course the uncertainties about the transition in 2024. And now some general points on leading geopolitical and security trends. Well, first of all, it is the strategic decoupling, which is now called strategic decoupling by all mainstream experts. The United States is leaving Europe as the pivot of its strategy, and this has started not with Trump, it started with George Bush, the Jr., and then augmented by the foreign policy of Obama. And the idea of the global strategy of the European Union and of its strategic autonomy is something that, from my point of view, would not have been born if not the strategic decoupling between the United States and Europe. The second is, of course, the rise of China, and I'm not going to dwell on it further. Then the failure of both grand bargaining and new bipolarity visions or concepts. Great bargaining, meaning chimerica. We were discussing chimerica for quite a long time, but not in the last 5 or 7 years. Nobody now recalls what is it, chimerica. And new bipolarity is quite a fashionable concept and idea these days, that the world is going to revolve around the relationship of two countries, meaning China and the United States, but not in terms of bargaining, of new grand bargaining, but in terms of something what we witnessed during the period of the Cold War. The relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. From my point of view, new bipolarity is not possible, and one of the reasons is that unlike the USSR and the United States, China and the United States heavily depend on each other. But at the same time, they are rivals in the strategy of the United States, at least in the military and the security strategy of the United States in the 21st century. Of course, China is the main competitor and rival. And this is written in all strategic documents of the United States. So this is, from my point of view, a conflict which could not be resolved, a conflict between interdependence in economic sphere and the conflict with geopolitical strategies of these two countries, which are on the diverging course. Well, we still use such expressions as collective West, the West, etc., etc. From my point of view, instead of the collective West, nowadays we have quite obviously dual core West. The West which inclines mainly on two pillars. This is the United States and the European Union. This is, I call, dual core West. And how the West is going to proceed with its influence and power depends upon if the United States and the European Union are going to find a kind of a new modus vivendi and not to morph into something different from what is a conception of the West. And also, from my point of view, it is important to point out that nowadays we do not have superpowers. What we have, and even probably great powers, the term which we inherit from the 19th century. What we have these days are niche powers instead of great powers, not to mention superpowers. Niche powers meaning niche, that you have a certain niche where you are a leader. And there are many niche powers. Some countries enjoy many niches. where they are still most powerful, but it is impossible nowadays to find a country which would be across the range of niches to be a predominant power. I just would like to remind us that in 1945, the share of the United States in global GDP was close to 50% of global GDP. These days, it is 16. So there is a big difference between 50 and 16. Then the near collapse of strategic stability and arms control, from my point of view, not the climate change, which is a great danger, but still this is not the immediate danger. The near collapse of strategic stability and arms control is the immediate danger. And my last observation on these general points is that, well, I do European studies, and I'm going to say something with a heavy heart, that the world is not anymore a Eurocentric project, and the world probably after the Second World War transformed from being Eurocentric to double-centric, and in the 1990s West-centric. But now it is obviously Asia-centric, and I think that the 21st century, much later in textbooks, will be characterized as Asia-centric world. And now in the conclusions, I will try to identify some big ideas which can save us from the dismal situation in global politics. And the first one is Helsinki 2, nothing new. We have been discussing it for many years now. Helsinki 2 as an heir to the final act signed in the capital of Finland back in 1975 by 35 states, including the United States and Canada. But of course, nowadays nobody would like to copycat the Helsinki of 75. But the idea that something should be done on the level of those countries which firstly have some influence or ability to project their strategic thinking, and secondly, those countries which think that in political terms we do not live in the world of new normality. I think that we live in political terms in the world of abnormal situation which should be well stopped as soon as possible. The second big idea is a pan-European security system, and also it has been discussed very thoroughly. Unfortunately, with no avail so far. You remember President Medvedev put on the table the idea of the European Security Treaty back in 2008, even before the war with Georgia, when the situation was quite okay, but still it was ignored and marginalized very quickly. Now we have, on the part of the European Union, some interesting initiatives like a European Security Council or European Intervention Initiative, which President Macron is so proud of and trying to push it forward. So maybe pan-European security system can be based on some new novelties which now are evident in the political thinking, not just of Russia, but of France, of Italy, of to some extent Germany, and hopefully Spain. Next is moratorium on the deployment of new INF systems in Europe. The United States in August this year left the INF treaty, a huge blow to the whole architecture of strategic stability. And you know that Russia suggested and Putin sent to all members of NATO a letter proposing to sign a moratorium on the deployment with verification mechanisms, because immediately this proposal was brushed aside due to the argument that ostensibly Russia has this rocket 9M729. I am confused now a bit. But this proposal, the verification mechanism was embedded in that proposal. So why not? Let's verify, and if somebody breaches rules, then this state will have to change its behavior. Then what is a must is the return to the GCPA, the nuclear deal with Iran, and the decision of the United States to abandon the deal, of course, was a major blow to the whole terrible situation in the Middle East, and from our point of view, contributed much more to further destabilization than to finding any solutions to the deep-rooted and entrenched problems in that region. Then something very new. This is the P5 conference. The Putin put forward this idea in Israel when more than 50 world leaders took part in commemorations of horrible event during the Second World War. And France supported it. China said yes. The United States are still in two minds, but there are some signs that they may say yes. And the UK is usually is waiting for the United States to take a decision and then either to join the meeting or not. But it's clear that if four permanent members of the Security Council are meeting in a certain framework of a conference, then of course London is going to join. And two last points: a system of regional security in the Persian Gulf. This is something what Russia has been pushing forward for the last 2 years. The system which to some extent may be modeled on Helsinki 1975, to make all regional countries to sit at one table and to work out certain modus vivendi. First of all, in security terms. We remember that in 75 we had 3 baskets, but at least to focus on one basket in the Persian Gulf region, the basket of security. And the last but not the least, I think what is very important for the immediate future of arms control is multilateral negotiations on cybersecurity and on the prohibition of militarization of space. These are two domains which, if not somehow harnessed or managed, may inflict huge damage on the remnants of the architecture of global stability, which still we enjoy. But cyber and space is something what, black swans, which are black to the extent that it is very clear that they will, put the final nails, hit the final nails to the coffin of arms control system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexei. You've given us rather a dense and detailed agenda of things that the West and Russia might do. You rather cleverly sidestepped the whole issue of interference and influence, and perhaps I will ask you in a minute, or you can tell us in a minute, whether that is because you actually think there is no interference, or whether you think that this is really not a very relevant topic, and therefore we should concentrate on the deeper causes, as Jeffrey was also suggesting. Very quickly, perhaps Adam and Jeffrey, and then we can throw this over to the public.
Yeah, I think it needs to be very quick because we've left rather little time for
half an hour,
the
yes.
audience. I just wanted to make 2 or 3 very quick points. One is how there's at least a perception of difference between Geoffrey and me on how central the question of influence versus interference is. I think, in fact, we're largely saying the same thing. There's quite a lot about how a country behaves that is beyond the control of governments and yet is perceived as threatening by others. But I would like to renew my argument that while Geoffrey is right that that kind of influence or even more directed governmental interference is perhaps a symptom, it is also something that drives current bad relations. And the US Congress will not let the next US president re-engage with Russia to the extent wished because Russia is perceived as having interfered in the 2016 and 2020 elections, at least as I understand it. So we need to get, if we're going to get to some of the things that Alexei is suggesting we should do, negotiations on non-militarization of space or whatever, we have to get to a rather better place than we are at the moment. Second point, insecurity drives perceptions of threat, not influence. I think that's correct. And so there's a question about how insecure the United States is going to go on feeling, that I hope Geoffrey will address, how insecure Russia is going to go on feeling, because I think a great deal of its disruptive behavior continues to be driven by a sense of not being solid at home or safe abroad, and whether we are going to see a continuation of what I think is an underlying policy of the Trump administration, which is that the United States should become the greatest disruptor, that the disruption plays to US strength because the US is the strongest country. If that is the case, then we need to talk even more about acceptable and unacceptable behaviors because we're not going to get into actual agreements. Thanks.
Thank you, Geoffrey.
Okay. I will take a stab at those questions. And then one other point that I wanted to make. On this issue of symptoms and causes, I agree that they're, in some sense, they are now, in particular, interrelated. The relationship is bad, not because of interference, but interference having been added to the agenda has made the relationship worse, and in some ways made some of the other problems more intractable. So I don't know how you quite get out of that problem. Part of the difficulty, of course, is that the things in the interference realm that are the source of the problem are things that have happened in the past. We can't go back and have Russia uninterfere in the 2016 election, as much as perhaps many of us would like. So this is now part of the background of the relationship. And the sanctions that were imposed over Russian behavior in the 2016 election are going to be with us for the foreseeable future because we can't go back and redo the 2016 election. And I think that's an unfortunate development. And I think that the way that those sanctions were adopted and implemented by the United States Congress was regrettable precisely for that reason, because it means that there's not an easy way of removing them or going back to a more normal relationship, even if, say, the 2020 election goes off without accusations of foreign interference. So we're sort of stuck in this dilemma right now, And I think, as I said, the way forward is having a very broad dialogue that encompasses this topic, but that deals with the longer term and enduring drivers of confrontation, things that are more tractable to diplomatic resolution, like European security, arms control, and the like. How insecure are we? Well, I dare say that the United States feels itself pretty insecure right now. And that is true across the political spectrum for different reasons. The U.S. is going through a period of generational demographic change that is driving political change in a way that hasn't been seen probably in a century. I wouldn't go back to the Civil War, but I would go back to the early 20th century, and the Gilded Age and the fights over Chinese exclusion and everything else, as the last period where there was quite the same level of demographic and political churn that we're seeing now. And I don't think that getting through this period is going to be easy or is going to resolve itself quickly. And as long as that process is going on, I think this feeling of insecurity is very much going to be there, at least among certain elements of the population. One other thing that I didn't mention during the talk, and I sort of hinted at it with this discussion of domestic vulnerabilities, but one of the areas where I do think there really needs to be much more focus in the United States and elsewhere is on financial transparency. And this is an area where the distinction between influence and interference gets kind of murky, because business, financial transfers, these are all sources of influence. And again, this isn't unique to Russia and its presence in the United States, but any sort of foreign country or foreign entity that has financial or business interests in the United States has an interest in what goes on in U.S. politics, and those financial stakes provide a source of influence. I think there's growing concern about the non-transparent nature of some of these financial flows, both their connection to members of the political elite, and this is some of the 2016 story, but also in terms of the impact on the overall macroeconomy. And the UK, for instance, the presence of foreign money in the London real estate market, I know is a very sensitive subject. But I think if we're going to deal with this problem, this is one of the big elephants in the room where really there needs to be more focus. And the final thing I wanted to come back to is this issue of bipolarity and you know how much of this should we think of in a bipolar framework, that is a U.S.-Russia framework. Obviously, that's the topic of our discussion today, but as Alexei said, to the extent that the world is becoming bipolar, it's not the U.S. and Russia, it's the U.S. and China. And I think some of these same concerns, some of these same considerations about influence and interference are, at least in the United States, and I think in Europe too, at least equally, if not more relevant when it comes to the nature of the relationship with Beijing. And so while we can talk about how the US-Russia or the Europe-Russia relationship evolves and can be improved, I think it's also worth keeping in mind that we're facing some of these same challenges from other quarters. And again, I listed in my talk not just China, but other countries that the United States has accused, or people in the United States have accused in one way or another of seeking to interfere in American politics. But it's most salient when it comes to China. And so I think when we have these conversations, it's obviously there is a bilateral transatlantic dimension to them, but the problem itself, the problem of figuring out what is and isn't legitimate in terms of foreign influence, is one that very much goes beyond the confines of the relationship between the West and Russia.
Thank you. Alexei, very briefly, in particular perhaps, how vulnerable does Russia feel, if at all?
Well, Russia is obsessed with strategic vulnerability. And this is not a new phenomenon, but it is something what was a nightmare for Russian strategies for the whole of the 20th century, at least. If to think rationally, the country with the resources of Russia cannot be an omnipotent and globally present power which interferes in whatever is going on across the planet. I would just like to remind us that the topic of Russia's interference surfaced only when the Democratic Party lost to the Republican Party in 2016. Before that, Russia was called, Obama coined this expression, and the Democratic Party was very happy to use it. Russia was called a regional power. But after the Democratic Party lost, immediately the narrative changed, and Russia became, you know, a mighty juggernaut interfering almost in all political process across the planet. How could that happen? From a regional power, the narrative of Obama, to the power, to a huge power and mighty power. So from my point of view, if even to think just rationally and logically without knowing the facts, there is a problem with this kind of thinking and accusations. Well, then let's presume that Russia interferes. If we know for sure what does it mean to interfere or to project your influence. But let's presume that Russia was not interfering for quite a long time. For example, in the 90s, few people would argue that Russia was interfering in 90s. It was a very weak country on the brink of breakup, like the Soviet Union. And how people inside Russia were seeing the world around them and the behavior of other states. Well, the United States, before the end of the Cold War and after the end of the Cold War, especially were very skillful in interfering, including in military interfering, as well as many of their allies. And I am not going to count now and to list all the examples. Then we have, well, all the facts from WikiLeaks and Assange, etc., how special services were spying on each other, on Merkel, etc., how the communication of the non-permanent members of the Security Council back in March 2003, their communications were hacked by the American special and British special services, because Tony Blair at that time was very active in trying to persuade the majority of the non-permanent members of the Security Council to support the resolution which would allow and justify the military intervention in Iraq. To some extent, Russia emulates what was invented before it started doing it by other countries. For example, the concept of soft power. This is a concept which was formulated in the United States by Nye. So Russia in the past 20 years, and this is a fact of life, has invented several means and instruments of projecting its, first of all, its soft power, when it is necessary, its military power, And of course, cyber power is something what is not regulated at all in international law. That's why whatever somebody is doing cannot contradict the international law because there are no regulations. Russia proposed many times to the United States to send specialists from both countries to sit somewhere in the third place and to start discussing it. There have been several rounds of consultations between Russian specialists on cyber, French specialists, and specialists from several other countries behind the closed doors. They were not public, but they took place. So I think that I guess that if P5 managed to gather and to talk in the framework of P5 conference, then most probably the issue of cyber will be one of the top on the agenda of that discussions. Because Russia is quite a major cyber power, but far from being the most powerful. The United States is the most powerful cyber power. That's why it is in the interest of those who are not so powerful as the United States to regulate this sphere. But it is impossible for Russia or for China to regulate this sphere. Is the most powerful player in the cyber domain, is not a stakeholder, is not a member of a new framework of agreements. So let's see what they're going to discuss at P5 conference. And from my point of view now, this is not a question of if, but a question of when. For Russia, it would be ideal if P5 meet in Moscow in May, but I do not think that for Trump it may be acceptable because of the campaign. Maybe it may be the United Nations in September when the new General Assembly meets. But chances are quite high, and again, from my point of view, cyber will be one of the top issues for the discussion.
Okay, yeah. I was saying welcome back after the coffee. My name is Cristina Manzano. I'm director of Es Global, a publication on global affairs in Spanish. And I first of all want to thank Mira for the invitation for being here in this very interesting, timely and necessary seminar. Let me start with an anecdote. Several years ago, I read an article in Foreign Affairs where the author tried to explain why the United States was caught unguarded for the annexation of Crimea, for the sudden reappearance of Russia as a global power. And what the author, the explanation the author gave was that for the last decade, before that time, the US had cut funds in funding research and the number of scholars and the number of programs studying Russia and studying the United States and Russia relationships. Because, you know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of the Soviet Union, many people in the States thought that it was not necessary any longer. It's been mentioned before. We were in a unipolar world, we had a hegemon, and there was no need for that kind of practice and expertise any longer. It was very interesting because what the author defended, of course, was the need for funding for research, for international relations research and appropriate centers and people to help us explain and understand what is going on in the world. And I would like to add not only regarding Russia and West relationships, but in general. It is heard so often that we live in a very complex world and that we need more of this expertise, while at the same time fundings and sources of understanding are being reduced. Having said that, we've heard that Russia and the West have become an obsession for many of us. And while this obsession was being reborn, a new obsession appeared, which is the obsession with Russia and the rest. Suddenly, again, Russia appeared as a very important and active global player. And despite all these issues that also have been mentioned before, despite demographic problems within Russia, despite the economic problem situations, etc., despite everything, Russia is acting as a very important global player. And as I was saying, that has become an obsession for many Western observers and, of course, policymakers. So first of all, also, I want to thank the speakers in the previous panel for helping us understanding a little bit better what is happening in the West and Russia. And now we will face, as you know, we will try to offer some light in the state of the relationship and the understanding of how Russia is acting in the rest of the world as a global player. By the way, the title of this session, Russia and the Rest, is Russia Against the West and with the Rest, coincides with the title of a book by a scholar named Angela Stent at Georgetown University. I'm not sure I recommend it. Sorry about that. Sorry if there is any friend around. Her major conclusion is that in order to understand and in order to face the perceived challenge that Russia and the rest poses, she recommends strategic patience, which I don't think it's very original anymore. I think we really need to rethink the way we talk to Russia, and also we observe and we understand the world as a whole. Well, for that, we have three very interesting and knowledgeable people here. We have Nicolás Pascual de la Parte, who is a diplomat, a Spanish diplomat, former Spanish ambassador to NATO. Thank you, Nicolás, for being here. We also have Sergei Lukonin, who's head of China Studies, of the China Studies section at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, IMEMO in Moscow. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sergei, for being here too. And Mira Mirosevic, who's a senior analyst for Russia and Eurasia at the Royal Kano Institute. As the same format in the previous session, I'll give them each 10 minutes, more or less than more, for a first set of remarks, and then we will open the conversation first between them and then with all of you. So, Nicolás, please.
Thank you very much. This is working well. Thank you very much. My first words has to be of thankfulness and gratitude to the Elcano Institute for setting up this interesting seminar on Russia and the West and Russia against the West, and to thank also Mira Milosevic, who is sitting beside me, for having invited me as well to take part in this seminar. Thank you very much, Christina, for your introductory works. I think that after having been listening very carefully to the participants in the first panel of the seminar, one or two conclusions were clear: that the situation, the relationship between China and the West is not optimal, is suboptimal, to put it mildly, or even bad, and that we have to be able to figure out common grounds of re-engagement with Russia, because it's such a powerful country that we cannot isolate or we cannot live back to Russia. These are perhaps the main framework in which I should introduce some insights in the situation, so that we could together come at the end with common conclusions or common fields of engagements with Russia. Let me only think, and under the control of Christina's timing, that Russia, Putin's Russia, is a kind of revisionist Russia vis-à-vis the previous one. And the first question that comes to my mind, and probably to your mind as well, is why Putin's Russia is so revisionist of the international world order, which is his which is behind that, which is the undercurrent which nourishes this revisionist attitude towards the liberal order. And here I think that before answering to this question, if this question can be answered, if somebody can put himself in Putin's mind, which is quite a difficult task indeed, because I think that he has not a strategy, he's improvising more than he's more a tactical, more than a strategic man, is that if Russia really wants to readjust the current international order in order to find its place in it, with a more important role in it, but only to reshape, to readjust, or it wants something else. It wants really to revise the world order and to set up a new one. And that's why he could also play the role of a spoiler of the current international order. To put it in a nutshell, it is only a reshaper of the international order or a rethinker of a new international order. And this could bring us to many reflections. The first one is that not only Russia is rethinking the post-Cold War international liberal order, and we like to call it, but also the US, which is more unilateral, protectionist, inward-looking, and nationalist than ever before. I agree that this is not only due to Trump, it comes from behind, probably from the times of President Obama, indeed, when he was talking about leading from behind. Leading from behind means that the United States would lose voluntarily the leading role in managing the affairs of the world and would be leading from behind whatever happens. But Bush as well, Bush Jr. was also very reluctant to abide to the rule-based wall of the post-Cold War. Then Russia is Putin's Russia in this framework of a changing world in which the parameters, the paradigm, the pillars of the order, the world order are put into question. Putin is taking advantage and saying, okay, then if it is the case, I will try also to introduce, to bring forward the Russians' interest in a way that we come back to the times of Russia being a superpower. The question is, can Putin's Russia become a superpower with an economy which is only 3% of the world GDP, with a country which has a demographic devastating future, and an economy which is not sophisticated at all, an economy which is dealing only with, or surviving only with the extraction and the export of raw materials, oil, gas, gold and other minerals, weapons and nuclear reactors, but you cannot find any Russian product in an airport duty-free except for vodka. I mean, Russia doesn't produce anything that it is sold abroad except for these particular realms: weapons, raw materials, and nuclear reactors. With this economy based on these sectors, can Russia really pretend to be a superpower? Another reflection that I wanted to bring to your attention is the belief, the deep-rooted belief of the Russians in its own exceptionalism, something which is not unfamiliar to the Americans as well. The sheer size of Russia, being the largest country on earth, the history of a country which has been the bulwark of the Slavic civilization, the consciousness of having a historical task, a historical destiny to fulfill, the Third Rome, after the fall of Rome and Constantinople, Russia thought that Moscow had a special destiny of becoming the Third Rome and the bulwark of the Slavic cultural world, the Orthodox Church, and the feeling that was also raised before, the vulnerability that Ambassador was saying before the camera, the vulnerability that the Russians have felt throughout the last centuries because we, Europeans, we have invaded them 4 times. 4 times in the last few centuries. The northwards, when the Swedish king Gustav Adolf was in 1787-89 invading northern Russia. Later on, Napoleon. Later on, the Crimea War, 1854-56. And the last one, Hitler's German Nazi invasion. I mean, from the West, they have received only invasions. Then it is easy to understand the vulnerability that they feel as a nation vis-à-vis Europe. But at the same time, there is another school of thinking in Russia, or two, if you allow me, two schools of thinking. Those who think that Russia has to come to the West, to approach the West, to emulate the West, to look as much akin to the West in order to develop as a modern country, from Catherine the Great and so on and so forth. And those who think that no, Russia has to be more Russia, no less Russia, to have a bright destiny. For instance, Dostoevsky. The great Dostoevsky thought that Russia has to look inside and not to look outside in order to become more powerful and a more resilient and assertive nation. I think that all these school of thinking are undergoing still the landscape, the political, the social and economic landscape in Russia. Putin's Russia, well, Putin himself is bringing together many elements from traditional Russia, nationalism, Orthodox Church, traditional family framework, family values, traditional values, and at the same time a kind of exceptionalism that doesn't allow Russia to come into the international order put up by the US and the West after the Second World War. We tried to reach out to Russia in the European Union and NATO. We set up with Russia the fourth realms, the four tenets of cooperation with them. But it's true that Russia, whether under Putin or otherwise, has never felt itself a normal nation to come to terms with the role meant for them from the West, to be a normal country integrated in the security, economic, and commercial structure set up by the West, and to be treated like Germany or like France or like United Kingdom. Russia will never accept this treatment. He wants to be recognized as a special country, exceptional country, with a historical role, with a kind of a special destiny, which means that he has to be treated in equal footing with the US and with the other superpowers like China. And I think that it is a kind of crossroad in which the Putin's Russia, and above all, post-Putin Russia, has to take a decision. Where to belong to and how to behave. So far, Putin's Russia has tried to create a kind of a framework of behavior vis-à-vis the West or against the West, making an unnatural alliance with China. China and Russia, for many centuries and for many reasons, are unnatural allies. They have very different interests in Asia, in Siberia, and now this unnatural and artificial alliance against the West, and especially more particular against the US, is the only thing that is bringing them together. But it's not a pillar on which Russia could obviously foresee its future in a permanent, solid alliance with China, because it's conjunctural, it's fragile, it's weak, it's unnatural, I say. Concerning Europe, and here I have to be critical with ourselves, with the Europeans, and also somehow with the American friends. The problem with Europe and the US vis-à-vis Russia, to my mind, is that we don't have a real strategy towards Russia. What we have now is something not to be called a strategy. We have the dual approach in NATO, as well as in the European Union, in NATO, in the Wales Summit in 2014, afterwards in Warsaw Summit in 2016, and Brussels Summit 2018. We came upon the dual approach, to impose sanctions on Russia and at the same time to keep the door open in order to reach out to them if they want to come back to normal behavior. It is the dual approach with the carrot and the stick. The same we have in the European Union on the 5 principles of February 2016. But this is not a strategy, it is a modus vivendi. And a strategy is something finalist. This is only something instrumental to live together with Russia, but it's not a strategy. What does the European Union or the US want vis-à-vis Russia? To isolate Russia? To contain Russia? To confront Russia? To collaborate with Russia? This is the strategy. We don't know. We only have a kind of modus vivendi to improvise a kind of coexistence with Russia. And we will not have either in NATO or in the European Union a strategy if the United States doesn't lead in NATO and Germany doesn't lead in Europe, which is not the case so far. Something that we have to look into very seriously, really. Then, what what is to be done. But before I approach this tenet, I wanted only, as previous ambassador to NATO, only to touch upon the security relationship with Russia. The Russians have developed a quite sophisticated array of new weapons in the framework of hybrid war and cybersecurity, which are in some realms much more advanced than ourselves. I agree with you that in a kind of traditional, conventional terms, a war with Russia will be always on the side of the West. Sooner or later, we have much powerful resources and means. But the Russians probably will never conceive, at least for the time being, a kind of traditional fight or battle or war in the prairies of Middle Europe, like in the Second World War. What they try now is to go between the two zones of peace and war. It's a gray zone between peace and war, which is neither peace nor war, which is interference, which is cyber attacks, and which is a hybrid war and destabilization of the political landscape in Western countries. They will be so smart as not to launch the Article 5 response of the Treaty of Washington, which means a retaliatory attack once of the members of the NATO alliance is attacked or is feels to be attacked by a third country. They will behave in such a way that will never be enough to launch this military all-out reaction from the NATO allies. And that's why in this gray zone between peace and war, they move very comfortable. And we Westerners, we don't. We don't have the same instrument, the same strategic thinking and tactical approach as the Russians do. And we should develop such an approach as they do. Russia, and I will go very quickly because I think I'm running out of time, is using its now regained strength in order to expand and to give a new boost to its foreign policy and to regain the international status of a great power. We have said before that probably they don't have the objective elements to become a superpower, but at least they want to have an enhanced profile in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean Sea, and in Central Asia. In Central Asia, hand-to-hand with China, obviously, with the new Silk Road. They know that they cannot do anything now in Central Asia without China. In the Middle East, after the unilateral withdrawal of the United States and the weak footprint of Europe, mainly of France and Great Britain, the Russians have seen a window of opportunity to come back to the Middle East in Syria, and they are doing pretty well, to be honest. And now, obviously, they are seeing the same scenario, possible scenario, the opportunist scenario in Libya, in which they want also probably to set the footprint, even if possible, to set up a military base. Well, not to blame them. They are obviously defending their national interests and trying to expand outside and to have a kind of new gain international status. They are prevailing and taking advantage of our weaknesses, of our lack of determination. But at the same time, I think that we should well advise our Russian friends that we want to have with them a real, as normal a relationship as possible. And we have a lot of realms in which we could improve our relationship with them, whether it is in security issues, obviously, counter-terrorism fight against terrorism, jihadism, international fight against international organized crime, against drug trafficking, against illegal migration, environment change, digital transition, so on and so forth, you name it. But for that, first of all, we have to regain some trust, some confidence. And when you don't have treaties and when you don't have laws upon which to set up trust, then you have to negotiate and to talk, face to face. Something that you have said, my previous panelists, we are not doing enough. We have to re-engage with them as much as possible in all possible forums, whether in NATO or the European Union. And some advice to our friends, our Russian friends. You cannot become a superpower anyway in the 21st century with intimidation and without friends. It's impossible. I mean, you cannot be a superpower if you don't have friends or allies, wholehearted allies, voluntary friends. the Russians don't have many. They are surrounded by countries which have fear from Russia, or are intimidated by them, or are pressed by them, coerced into coming to terms with Russia. Upon this base, you cannot be a superpower. We are not in the 19th century, we are in the 21st century. You need friends, you need allies, voluntarily one. Then, to come quickly to the end, I think that Russia is coming back to the Middle East, to the Mediterranean, to the Central Asia. It's not possible for them to have a real influence or clout in Latin America, Africa, and Asia because they don't have an economy allowing them to do so. They cannot export anything interesting for them, and they can only do some kind of raw materials exchanges. And the provisional conclusions will be that if we want to cooperate with them, if we want to find common ground in order to reach out to them, we have to rebuild our trust links and to try to set up a real strategy within NATO and with the European Union vis-à-vis Russia. Thank you very much indeed.
Just a quick question, Nicolas. In this process of that you described, you also mentioned that somehow Russia is filling a void. I mean, in the case of Syria, for example, in the case of the Middle East in general, Russia is really doing very good work, a very good job in some aspects. I'm thinking about the chemical weapons, for instance, in Syria. It was their initiative, it was well presented, and it's now being implemented. Up to what point this that you described is mainly our fault? I mean, if you, as the West, and again thinking about the United States, if you are creating that void in world leadership, others will want to fill it. And in this case, Russia is taking that opportunity, which is not exactly the same as you, well, in my opinion, as you mentioned, being opportunistic.
Okay.
A very quick comment.
Fine. I think that Russia has been opportunistic in the Middle East. It's not to blame them. I mean, something not to be proud of, the way they are behaving in the Middle East and in Syria, because they have come in order to bulwark a dictator and to intervene militarily regardless of the civil casualties and so on and so forth. But they have understood that we are coming back to a kind of multipolar world in which the power politics are back. And in this power politics, with a sphere of influence, coercion, and military build-up, they feel comfortable because it's the way they have been behaving in the last centuries. If you want, I think that they feel comfortable in a world of carnivores. We Europeans, we are herbivores. I mean, the European Union was set up for a post-national, rule-based human rights world, which is not anymore here in front of us. And then we are surrounded by carnivores, Russia, the US, China, and we are an herbivore. And we have not the protection of our main carnivore, which was the US. And that's why the European Union is not well equipped to deal with this new power politics in which sphere of influence, military build-up, and the force of rule, another rule of force is in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beware, veganism is gaining ground everywhere, so we might reach there. Sergey, please, we have this overview, and you're not going to explain us what is the relationship between Russia and China.
Yes, actually I do not like a very abstract topic, and I would like to focus my speech particularly on Russian-Chinese cooperation.
Micro.
Do I need to...
Micro.
Just speak... okay, sorry. So, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this great event. Thank you very much. And my topic will take about 10 minutes. I would like to talk about two levels of Russian-Chinese cooperation. As you know, there are two levels in Russian-Chinese relations. First, I would like to talk about ideal world of Russian-Chinese cooperation. The first level I will call unprecedented high level of cooperation. Here we have a comprehensive strategic partnership, regular and frequent meetings of state leaders, joint military exercises, similar positions on many international issues like Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, and so on. and the desire for deeper economic integration within the framework of the so-called conjunction of the Silk Road Economic Belt and Eurasian Economic Union. To give you some proof of my thesis, I would like to talk about Russian-Chinese trade. In 2019, the total trade turnover exceeded 110 billion US dollars. Chinese companies entered into the capital of Russian oil and gas companies, for example, Yamal LNG project, the petrochemical company Sibur, the Arctic LNG project, and others. Russia have launched the Power Siberia gas pipeline, and now we are discussing the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline. Russia supplies modern weapons to China. For example, between 2014 and 2018, Russia's shares in total arms import to China was about 70%, and Russia supplied, for example, S-400 missile system and Su-35 fighters, and so on. Russia and China are working together to develop and create a missile warning system for China. Russia and China continue to development of the long-range wide-body passenger plane, heavy helicopter, and so-called big aircraft engine. Russia and China have started cooperation in the use of global navigation satellite systems, GLONASS and Beidou. China is gradually opening its market to Russian agricultural products, grain, poultry, meat, and beef. And the final, Russia is becoming an important transit route for Chinese goods. For example, in 2018, about 270,000 TEU containers goes from China to Europe through the territory of Russia, and this is about 70% of the total number of the containers going from China to Europe. And to summarize my thesis, if earlier usually we say that the Russian-Chinese political partnership is not supported by trade, economic, scientific, and technical ties, now the situation is changing. Of course, not so fast as we would like to, but the basis of Russian-Chinese trade and economic cooperation is expanding. Of course, the main drivers here are Russian policy turn to east or pivot to east, and of course, United States, trade war between United States and China. And now I would like to talk about the second level. It's not so ideal. Here we have not clear yet and hidden yet mutual concerns and contradictions. First, because the strategic interests of Russia and China do not completely coincide. Second, because of China's new global ambitions, which are formed on the basis of its growing economic and technological power. And these concerns and contradictions may not arise in the future, but there is a possibility. First, Russia and China have different attitudes to the existing world order. For Russia, the world order, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is rather unfair. It is desirable to change it. For China, the existing world is not perfect, of course. It is not fair for 100%, but however, it does not need to be radically changed. And China rather wants to supplement it with its own capabilities, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. Actually, before the United States started the trade war, China was satisfied by existing world order and just want to expand its own role, and that's all. Second, Russia and China have different levels of clarity about their strategic foreign policy and foreign economic goals. For China, the most important now is to promote Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore, everything that is good for Belt and Road, good for China. For Russia, for China, it's sometimes very hard to understand what Russia wants. From the point of view of some Chinese experts, Russian behavior sometimes seems a little bit aggressive and unpredictable. Third, Russia and China have different economic and technological potential for implementing their strategic foreign policy and foreign economic projects. China has finance, technology. For Russia, it's quite difficult to implement its own projects or to support Chinese on the parity basis. Fourth, Russia and China have different economic strategies. Shortly, China is promoting economic development, and in Russia, only after appointment of the new cabinet of ministers, we start to think about stimulating economic development, about implementing national projects, their effectiveness, and stimulating the growth of people's income. Fifth, at the first glance, Russian-Chinese trade and economic relations are developing. However, the quality for Russia is changing very slow. Still, the main volume of Russian export to China is natural resources. The share of Russian food and agricultural products exported to China is growing very slowly. The volume of Chinese investment in Russia is very small. China still offer to Russia tight loans, not investments, and Russia do not want loans. We need investments. And China, several years, holds the status of the biggest trading partner of Russia. It shares about 16%, and this can lead to Russia's overdependence on China. Sixth, the sanction imposed on Russia, quite serious problem in Russian-Chinese relationships. For example, Russian Central Bank has repeatedly explained to Chinese partners that personal US sanctions against Russian bankers or entrepreneurs do not apply to their companies. But in practice, Chinese businesses, especially large private ones, are afraid to do business with Russian partners because of the threat of so-called secondary sanctions. And sometimes it seems that Chinese companies follow the sanction regime more strictly than, for example, even European companies. Seventh, there are also contradictions within the Belt and Road Initiative. The implementation of the Chinese project within that Chinese initiative is quite slow. China is interested in providing tight loans, to expand share of using yuan, to expand the share of national high-tech equipment, and so on. And Russia, of course, is interested to support its own economy. And there are three main risks for Russia. First, the probable unprofitability of joint Russian-Chinese but resource-intense projects, and for which we would have to pay it, whatever the case. Second, the even stronger competition in the Russian domestic market because Chinese companies usually supported by the subsidies of Chinese government and so on. And third, technological degradation of national industry and additional burden on ecology because there is a risk that China will transfer outdated production bases to Russia from China. Eighth point, also we have problems within the Eurasian Economic Union because China traditionally built the bilateral relations between Russia or between China and Belarus, between China and Kazakhstan, for example, and do not understand that now it is a Eurasian Economic Union. So now I would like to try to answer the question, so what are the Russian main geopolitical and economic interests in China? The main geopolitical interest is to use the growing political and economic power of China to counter the United States, implementing for some Russian foreign policy and foreign economic projects. Economic interests are clear. It's Chinese market, creating joint production chains, entering third country markets by cooperating with the Chinese companies, attracting Chinese investments in Russian economy, and so on. But is it possible? I suppose that only to a certain extent, because China has its own geopolitical problems and projects and challenges. China do not want to support Russian economy. So there are a lot of problems in economic sphere. Do Russia's interests clash with the Western one in the different regions? I'm sure no. On the contrary, Russia is interested in multilateral cooperations, primarily with the European Union, in order to avoid the over-dependence on China. For example, within the so-called Russian policy turn to East or pivot to East, Russia seeks to balance cooperation with China by developing cooperation with South Korea, Japan, and the ASEAN countries. And the last news which I read this morning, the new Prime Minister of Russia, Mishustin, said that he is going to expand the cooperation with OECD countries just to balance foreign economic of Russia between China and European Union. Is Russia too here to stay, or its internal vulnerabilities, economic situation, and so on? For me, the main risk is the economic situation in Russia. Yes, it is stable, but the stable is not equal to development, and stability eventually leads to slow degradation. But I suppose that maybe a new cabinet of ministers will decrease the significance of that risks. And where and in what ways could Russia and the West cooperate? No, actually, I can start to talk about the security and so on, but it's traditional and maybe not interesting. But my thesis is that while the sanctions are in effect, we do not have much opportunities. So I think that now the most important things is cultural, humanitarian, diplomatic, scientific, and other cooperation. Because the isolation of Russia, the worst possibility which European Union can provide. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. One of the probably aspirations of Russia once the relationship with the West started to deteriorate is to create an alternative order. You've described that the current multilateral order from a Russian perspective has not been very beneficial, especially in the last times, whereas for China it has been very beneficial. It wants to keep it as much as it keeps stability for its economic development and deployment. I wanted to ask you something that somehow you've answered, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit more. Do you see any kind of common vision between Russia and China for a future world order? Do you see any kind of cooperation, of common thinking about how to develop this future world order?
There are some of them. The first and the main one, not interfere in the internal politics of countries. And the second one, everything should be done under their international legislation. The main one. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, now it's the floor. Mira, it's your turn. You're going to tell us about the relationship between Russia and Latin America, which is very important for a country like Spain.
Yeah.
And it has many implications, I assume.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Thank you very much for coming. And first of all, before I focus on the Russia and the Latin America, I just would like to make some remarks about the title of this seminar, because I am an organizer, and it's true that I took inspiration in the title of the Angela Stent book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. And meanwhile, I have been reading the book. I agree in this with Christina. I don't agree with everything, and for that, this second panel, the title is Russia Against the West and with the Rest, with the question mark. This is a kind of my reaction of the book. I recognized also that the title is very catchy, but in some ways obsolete too. I mean, we after the Munich Security Conference, above all, and the title of the conference, what Charles Powell this morning mentioned, the title of the Westlessness. So I think that is a good opportunity to talk about Russia. And first of all, I would like to highlight it that, as Nicolas mentioned, Russia is back. Many analysts talk about the return of Russia. And first of all, I would like to say that I think that the return of Russia is relative, in the sense that since Russia was present practically in all parts of the world since the Tsarist time and during the Soviet Union. And also I think that we can say that the absence of Russia from the international politics between 1991 and 2012, even maybe we can talk about the year of 2000 when Vladimir Putin came to power, and clearly we can see the disengagement of Russia in the Western politics. So, but above all, after the 2012, I think that this period between 1991 and 2012 is an anomaly that is due to its internal weakness and the result of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and collapse of communism. So Russia is back in some way, but also I think that Russia has always been there, no, in all parts of the world, throughout the Tsarist empire or the Soviet Union. And before I focused on the question of the main geopolitical and economic interest in Latin America, I think that also is very, very important to put clear some remarks about the context. The context here is very important if we would like to talk about the re-emergence or the return of Russia in Latin America, Middle East, or Eurasia. So the first important element of this context, first of all, is the growing role of China, not only in its process of deepening the relationship between China and Russia. I mean here more, I refer to the increasing role of Russia in all parts of the world. And just in context of the region of the Latin America, the United States still remains the region's dominant trade partner, but the trade between the countries of the Latin America and China is growing fast. Just facts, statistics, total trade between China and Latin America increased by over 200% between 2006 and 2016, compared with an increase of 38% with the US. Russia's role as a trading partner is clearly smaller. Even its trade in the region increased by 45.1% in last 10 years. The second element of the context of this re-emergence is the gradual withdrawal of the United States from the region from the Latin America in this case, after the 11 September, but also in the context, for example, of the Middle East. I think that the red line, which became the rose line, was what happened in Syria and about all issue about the chemical weapons. We can talk that I agree with Nicolas in it that Russia is an opportunistic player, and just the restlessness and the withdrawal of the United States of the different regions in the world is a huge opportunity for Russia. The third element is clear, that is the breakdown in the cooperation between Russia and the West as a result of the crisis in Ukraine. Also, we don't have to forget the crisis about Georgia. I think that we stopped to talk about Georgia and the war of the 2008, but clearly for example, in the region of the Latin America, the diplomatic and political activity of Russia has two peaks, activity in 2008 and 2014, marked by the breakdown in Russian cooperation with the West as a consequence of the war in Georgia and Ukraine. Also, what we have, what the panelists had mentioned in the previous panel, in many ways, Russia's reappearance in the Latin America is a response to perceived U.S. interference in the conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine and its support to the color revolutions. In this sense, Russia tried to play in some way the similar role in the neighborhood of the United States. The clear example of it is the case of Venezuela, and in some way Russia tried to identify the role of the United States in Ukraine and try to imitate its own role in Venezuela. Last but not least, Russia's activity in the region forms part of a broader international vision, whose main goal is to achieve great power status. I disagree in this point with Nicolas. I think that Russia would not like to recover the status of superpower. I think that Russia is completely conscious that that is not superpower, but yes, Russia tried to back to the international theater and to achieve again to be great power. And I think that the period of the Cold War and this bipolar world between two superpowers, or a unipolar moment of the United States after the 1991 is over, and the future of the world will be maybe we're back to the geopolitical competition between the great powers, and Russia, I'm sure, would like to be there. And now my second part of my talk will be really focused on explicitly on the geopolitical interest and economic interest of Russia and Latin America. And first of all, I think that we have to highlight it that what we know, all of us, that Latin America is not a homogeneous continent in the political or economic sense. So not all Latin American countries have the same relationship with Russia. We can divide them in three groups. One group is the old allies of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, then the countries which forms part of the group of ALBA, and with these countries have a clear anti-US positions, and ALBA group was formed by Cuba. There are also the member states are Venezuela and Bolivia. And the third group of the countries which have a good relationship with Russia are the trade partners. The relationship between Russia and Latin America is founded on two main geostrategic objectives. The first one is that both Russia as well as all Latin American countries really have interest to diversify its foreign relations. And the second main geostrategic objective, which share both the countries of the region and Russia, is to count the US power in the region and the world with the view to creating a multipolar or a post-Western international order. I think that here, when we talk about the multipolar or post-Western world order, we can talk a lot about it, but I really would like to highlight here that the key factor here is that Russia and the majority of the Latin American countries really share a concept of sovereignty that is one of the key concepts to understand this relationship and geopolitical objectives of the Latin American countries and Russia. And what Sergei said, first of all, what we expect, we don't want any interference in internal issues. China and Russia share this objective. We can say the same thing about the countries of Latin America and Russia. The first law for them is just not to permit any interference of foreign actors, and the concept of sovereignty for them is much more important than, for example, multilateralism. We all in the West and European Union, multilateralism is the heart of the international relations. For Russia, for China, and for many countries of the Latin America, the concept of sovereignty and this statement of no interference in internal issues is really the most important. Also, is very important to highlight that Russia and Latin American countries provide each other with the diplomatic and political support in international organizations against any US or United Nations sanctions, and in general to ensure neutrality in the event of any international intervention in these states. We have a lot of examples of it, and for example, the all resolution of the United States, which was initiative of the United States or United Kingdom, was blockaded in the Council of Security Council of the United Nations by Russia, by China, and with the support of the countries of the Latin America. I think that a part of this shared strategic interest, it's important to say that Russia and Latin America, this good relationship is favored by three factors. The first one is the absence of historic conflicts between Russia and the countries of the region. They're sufficiently far from each other. They don't have any historical problem. Also, the historic ties created during the Cold War. It's not only the case of the Latin American countries, but also of the countries in, for example, in the Middle East. And also, I think that is important to say that the both have the pragmatic approach to the bilateral relationship. I think what I want to say that Russia, for example, does not put as a criteria, for example, the respect of human rights in Venezuela or in Cuba. It's not an obstacle to have a good bilateral relationship. Russia does not ask for sanctions for these countries, and Russia has different approach and always is guiding by this principle of not interference in internal affairs. From conclude, I will be happy to respond to any question of Christina or audience. I think that that beyond geopolitical imperatives, that the Kremlin approach to Latin America is characterized by the realism and pragmatism, and also with the huge conscience of its potential, but also its limitations there. Latin America is not close neighborhood as, for example, is the Middle East. Russia has the different worries about security defense in Latin America. Then, for example, in the worries in the Middle East. So I see more Latin America as a mirror, a kind of mirror of the Russian attitude in the region, close to the United States, and just like intent to give to United States the same medicine, some of the same medicine, what is the base of the Russian perception, what is the United States is doing in the neighbor of Russia, no? in the Eurasia. Can we cooperate? I think that we, of course, we have to think about the pragmatic engagement. During the first panel, many speakers talk about it. But I really agree that isolating Russia and refusing to deal with it is not an option. But also, I think that is not an option to talk about reset in the way which it did Obama. Because I think that we have to achieve a realistic and flexible engagement with Russia. And I think that since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we really did not arrive to deal with Russia in these terms. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mira.
Thank you.
I have two very quick questions. One is you mentioned the pragmatic approach of Russia towards the relationships, bilateral relationships with the different countries in Latin America. How does that change, if it changes, with the changes in government? Because we've seen throughout the last 2 years, we've seen complete these changes, ideological changes mainly, in many countries in Latin America. I'm thinking, for instance, in Argentina. Russia had a very good relationship with Cristina Fernandez's Argentina. Then it somehow kept it with Macri's, somehow. And now Peronism is back. Have you noticed a real change in attitudes, in approaches, in exchanges during these 3 terms, or not?
Here, I think that is clear that the practical approach works because another example is Brazil. As we know, Bolsonaro also is very pro-Trump and talk all the time against the government of Vladimir Putin. But still, for example, Brazil is the main trade partner together with Mexico for Russia. Also, they are partners in G20, and I think that the main reason of this practical approach is that Russia, 2 main reasons. First one is that Russia signed Eurasian alliance, signed the agreement with Mercosur countries in 2018. And also in the Latin American countries like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile are really a very good substitute for the European Union countries after the sanctions for fruits, meat, milk, and so on. So the both parts have a huge economic interest. Even the Russian, the contribution of the bilateral commercial interchange between Russia and Latin American countries is only 2% of all Russian worlds in commercial interchange. But I think that both parts are looking for the new partners, and after the European Union sanctions, the countries of the Latin America are really occupied this space, and I think that will be for the long time.
Okay. And my second quick question, it's about Cuba, because Cuba had a very, very special relationship with the Soviet Union, a relationship that was afterwards replaced somehow by Venezuela, which is still trying to cover that. But, you know, with the economic situation and the crisis in Venezuela, we wonder how long it will be.
Reforms of the constitution that so far has been published, I understand that are not the final format, because they still are under discussion in the different institutions in Russia. Putin, if he's still in the Council of the Regions or the Council of the High Council, will have a very important role to play still. But anyway, answering to your question, I think that Russia, and I agree with Sergei here, will try to be pragmatic. And to deal and to engage commercially and politically with the countries on behalf of their own interest, not forgetting the exceptionalism that I featured before as one of the main characteristics of Russian foreign policy. Russia thinks of itself not to be a normal country, but to be a great country with a great history and a big culture. and to try to be on the same footing as of other powers. The most humiliating remark that Alexei was also raising before in the panel was when Obama said that Russia was a regional power. I think that they have never forgotten that.
I agree with Nicolas that after Putin, the 2024 will not mean the end of Putinism, at least. And I think that Putin will be present in some way in internal and in foreign affairs. But I think that like two principles will guide the Russian relationship with the rest of the world. The first is strategic autonomy. It's one of the strategic autonomy, but not in the European Union way, real strategic autonomy in the sense that Russia perceived that to be great power is just to be able to take your own decisions independently of the rest of the world and to have a capacity to influence and to be a very active actor in different parts of the world. So strategic autonomy with very jealous defense of the sovereignty and internal issues and internal domestic policies. And another principle and another guide of this relationship will be a pragmatic approach. And I think that Russians really conserve this pragmatic approach since the end of the Cold War. Maybe it's good also to remember that all this re-emergence of Russia in the different parts, relative re-emergence of Russia in the different parts of the world is also guided by the Primakov Doctrine, that Russia not had to be only the ally of the West or try to integrate itself in the Western institution, but also to have a relationship with another parts of the world. And I think that Primakov Doctrine will be actual in the future also after the Putin.
Thank you. Thank you very much to you three. I think it's very, very interesting. We've learned a lot, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.